Hi, welcome to Fiberchats. My name is Irina. I'm the host here, and I'm very honored to have my guest today. Sometimes I'm getting my guests that actually intimidate me. Today is one of those cases, and I actually told Cecelia that that's the case. So please introduce yourself because I'm afraid to screw up your last name.
So my name is Cecelia Campochiaro, or in Italian, Cecelia Campochiaro, but I usually just go by Cecelia or anything close that I know is me. And I don't mean to be intimidating. So hopefully at the end of this, I won't be so intimidating.
Well, I must tell you, like when I look at your books, right, it's almost this contradiction for me because you wrote Sequence Knitting and you wrote Making Marls. And to me, they're very different because sequence is like very technical, mathematical, and you're going like, okay, what's going to happen if I do 2+1, 2+2, 2+3, like all this? It's like very systematic thing, right? Whereas making marls is like your artistic expression. You're becoming like almost like Monet painting of the lilies, right? There is no hard rules. You just take whatever colors come your way and you mix them. How do you explain it to yourself? Like why there is so many facets to you?
So to me, they're actually closer. So sequence knitting is very structured. And in Making Marls, it came about because I was actually making a lot of pieces in sequence knitting using marls. And then I realized that the marls were pretty interesting by themselves and maybe worth a discussion. And then I started working out how marls work. And I realized that there is a mathematical underpinning to the combinations you can have with different colors. So for example, if you have 4 colors of yarn and you're going to work in 2-strand marls, those 4 colors have 6 possible combinations. And when you look at the patterns out there in the world using marls, you can see that most people aren't considering all the possible combinations. So for me, the big thing in Making Marls is it just shows you how to work out all the possible combinations and then do your design. And then you're still working in a fun way. Like I love the improvisational knitting of Kay Fawcett or Stephen West, but at least you're pulling from all the combinations that you could be playing with instead of hopefully getting them randomly. Does that make
Well, when
sense?
you look at their designs, right? When they do marl techniques, it's sort of like grab a basket of leftovers, put it next to yourself, pull whatever next ball of yarn in there, just
Right.
combine it with something that's going to create similar thickness to the previous 2 colors and continue knitting. Like it seems to me like when they do that improv marling, there is very little planning that goes into it, and definitely not making sure that you get all 6 variations of those colors, right?
Yeah, that's right. But okay, so I think that one of the things I see over and over again when I teach classes is I see my students, who are typically American women, are fearful of making bad color decisions. And then I watch Kay Fawcett or Stephen West make color decisions very quickly and very confidently. And I want to say to most people, it's really just having confidence. It's not like there's anything beyond confidence. So my process for marling is, let's say I have 4 skeins of yarn, because practically speaking, every color you buy is cost. So I have 4 skeins of yarn. Well, I'll create little tiny swatches, I call micro swatches, of the 6 combinations and maybe even the solids doubled. So I'll have 10 colors. And then when I do my play, if I think about pulling my yarn from the basket, I'll be pulling by looking at the micro swatches and knowing all the options. So for me, it's just a way of kind of seeing what's possible as I do my play.
So when you were working, you were actually creating microscopes.
Yes.
Do you think your obsession with micro swatches comes from your
For
first time?
microscopes, maybe. I was in a management role for most of my last 10 or 15 years of my career. And a lot of times when you're in a management role, people come to you with a problem, and your job is to say, well, what are our real options? How many options do we really have? Maybe this one you really hate, this one you really love, but let's look at the other three you haven't fully thought through, because maybe one of those is really the best. So I think that maybe more than the microscope, maybe just has led me to think about what are all the possibilities.
Right. Well,
Right.
let's talk about your knitting life, basically. Like, you've been knitting for years and years. How did you combine that with your career, and when did it become an animal of its own, basically?
Yeah. So I started knitting when I was probably about 12, and a friend of mine's mother inspired me to start knitting, and she would knit sweaters for my friend, her daughter, and they were like beautiful Aran Isle sweaters or Fair Isle. I mean, she was a power knitter. So I was really inspired by her, but I was a terrible knitter. So I would dream about all these things I was going to make, but I wanted to get done quickly. So I'd choose big yarn, but I didn't like the knit fabric that you got from big yarn. I didn't have good finishing details. So I would play a lot, but it kind of fizzled. I'd say by the time I kind of got through college, it kind of fizzled because I hadn't done anything well. In the early 2000s, a friend wanted to learn to knit, and that led to going to Stitches West in Oakland, when it was a pretty small show in Oakland, and all of a sudden seeing all these incredible knitters, all this yarn. It was the rise of the American kind of renaissance in knitting, and I just got carried away as a hobby. And, when I would go on business trips, I'd go try and find a yarn shop, or I'd go on vacations, and they would be centered around a knitting event. And it was really in 2013 when I had the idea for sequence knitting for a few years, and I finally had convinced myself it was a really important idea. I thought, I got to do something with this. And I decided I was going to write a book, and I was going to do it in my spare time. I was going to hire a book designer. I was going to hire an editor, and I was just going to do it at the pace I could do it. So that was really when I decided to make a go for it. And it took me a couple of years after that to have a book in hand. And by then, I think it was also, I was beginning to realize that the two worlds weren't all that compatible. So I think the seeds for leaving high tech were kind of planted in 2014 and 2015. And actually left my company in 2015 when the book launched, which was great because I had like 6 months off to go launch a book. And then I plunged right back into another company, and still in high tech. And I worked a few more years in high tech. And then I finally said, I think I can go just do this knitting thing full time, and really cut the cord. And that's when Making Marls, that's when I really plunged in and did Making Marls, which was wonderful to do it full time.
Well, do you ever question yourself, like, that decision? Do you ever say, like, I mean, because it's not easy to make money in the knitting world either.
Oh, yeah. Well, the real decision was to basically say, it's essentially an early retirement decision. You basically have to say, the knitting world doesn't pay very well most of the time. And can I afford to, let's just assume it pays nothing. Can I afford to go do this? And I kind of decided I could. So I really in a way, I self-funded my knitting life. And if you look at the knitting world, a lot of people have a benefactor, right? They have a spouse who works, or in my case, I basically, have my own career to kind of fund me doing this. But I feel very privileged because of that. And I also know that there are a lot of people who are trying to make a go in knitting where it is paying the rent. And I think that when someone's paying the rent with knitting, one should be extra kind to them because it's not easy.
Right. Well, how did your life change since you went into the knitting full time?
So my career was fairly demanding. So, it was certainly 5 days a week in the office, plus a pretty heavy travel load. And then you also would get emails and texts off hours. So it was a high power career in the sense that you were expected to work a lot more than 40 hours a week. So I think the biggest is, this is my studio here in California. It's just a bedroom in a house that's been made into a studio. But to get to kind of live in your thought life all the time. So I can spend hours in here by myself, and I can spend hours thinking about stitch pattern and never seem to get tired of it. And I think that to not have all these other responsibilities that you feel like you should be thinking about, that's been the biggest change.
Right. Well, is it, like when you knitting as a hobby, like when you have full-time job and you come home and you have like an hour or whatever, half an hour to knit while you're watching TV, it's one thing, right? When you sitting home and you have the possibility of knitting 12 hours a day or more, how do you decide for yourself when enough is enough? How do you moderate yourself?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good question. Okay. So when I was working full time, then the evenings were pretty important because I was basically doing the knitting, maybe an hour before work, in the evenings, and on weekends. And when you're knitting full time, you don't have those boundaries anymore. So for me, the arc of my day is such that in the morning I have thinking time. I get another 2 or 3 hours of thinking in the afternoon. So let's say between kind of 8:30 and 11:30 is a good block of time. And then between like 1 and 3:30 is a good block of time. I don't know about you, but 3:30, 4 in the afternoon, I'm usually not at my best. So that becomes a time to do something like errands or go cook. And then in the evening, I knit. And I use sample knitters because my knitting is slow, but I still do my own knitting in the evening. So at night I watch TV, and that's my time when I actually get knitting done. I don't knit very much during the day.
Well, okay, so when you knit for yourself, right, it's for pleasure. You knit whatever you desire at that moment, whatever pops into your head.
That's gone. No, those days are gone. I don't do any selfish knitting anymore. It's all every stitch has a purpose.
Do you miss that? Do you miss that, like
sometimes? So really, 2009 was when I first started working on sequence knitting. And once I had that aha about that idea, then I was like a fanatic about wanting to swatch ideas to see them. And so I haven't had this kind of casual, selfish knitting feeling since then. So what's it now? It's been like 13 years. And I look at my friends who aren't in the knitting business per se, and I'm sometimes jealous of just going off and like making a little toy or making someone else's pattern that you just think will be nice. But every time I think about doing that, I have all these ideas. I want to see how they manifest, and I can't bring myself to give that up to do selfish knitting. So it's a loss, but it's not the end of the world.
I think it was in January, I interviewed Susanna De Rosa, and she spent decades knitting swatches of Victorian lace. And she created this deck of cards that like has the lace picture on the front and the lace pattern on the back. And so she sent me a picture of herself standing next to this enormous wall that like basically like the size of the room, right? With all those little swatches. And I asked her, I said, like in the time that you could have made those swatches, you could have done like 10 shawls. Why spend your time on little swatches? And she said, well, I don't need another shawl, but it's really interesting for me to see what the swatch is going to look like.
Yeah.
Why you spend so much time on swatching? Like, what's your obsession with swatching?
So first of all, there's lots of different kinds of swatches. So all these little pizza boxes, you could see, you can't see them. Well, so let me show you. Hang on. So in my studio, on all of the shelves, I have stacks of pizza boxes full of swatches. And, let me put these down before I spill them.
That wouldn't be good.
And actually, and then if you look in one, it's full of swatches. So this kind of swatch for me is about taking an idea that came from a chart that I made on a computer and seeing what it looks like in a fabric. And I have a friend who makes these for me. So I will send a list of, here's a bunch of stitch patterns that I want to see in swatches. And then she'll make the swatches for me. So I don't actually do these myself And then there's the micro swatches about color. And those I do myself because I can't wait to see the color combinations. That's exciting. And then there's gauge swatches where whoever's going to knit the piece needs to do the gauge swatch. So I love swatching. And I think it's incredibly important for discovery. But if I did all of the discovery swatches, that's the only knitting I would ever get to do. So that's why I outsourced it.
Okay, so like a lot of people are on the other side of the spectrum as far as their love of swatching.
Yeah.
Probably including me.
Really?
Like I would avoid swatching if it's possible by all means. Like unless it's a garment where I test knit and I promise to swatch, I probably wouldn't swatch. Like if I can avoid it, I will, right? How would you explain the importance of swatching? Like what can you learn from swatching?
So I think there's two different things about swatching. One is it shows you possibility. So in the case of the micro swatches and the color combinations, it's showing you the possible colors that you have to work with. And in the case of a new stitch pattern that maybe nobody has ever knit before, it shows you what it's going to look like. So to me, those kinds of swatches are super exciting because you're learning something new from them that is kind of a little thrill. And I think probably, the lace knitting swatches were probably of that same, as kind of a journey of discovery to see what these fabrics would look like. That's interesting because you're seeing something maybe, at least for you for the first time, and maybe for all of humanity for the first time. You never know with knitting. The other kind of swatching, which I used to also hate and now I love, is risk reduction swatching. And I've been trying to explain swatching in my classes in the context of woodworking. If you are a woodworker and you're going to make a dresser or a table, you'll make all kinds of little things you call jigs. And the jigs are basically little tools to help you make cuts well, or to help you predict that your woodworking is going to be the way you want it to be. Well, that's to me what swatching is in knitting. If you're not sure about a certain finishing detail, you make a little swatch to see how it's going to look. If you're not sure about gauge, you make a gauge swatch. It's all risk reduction so that your final result works out well. So if you pick up the needles and you make a project and it comes out just the way you want it, then a swatch would have wasted your time. But if you pick up the needles and it doesn't work out the way you wanted, probably swatching would have fixed that.
I was talking to a friend who I was discussing a hat that I was thinking to make, right? And to avoid swatching, and I know that he made a lot of hats in his life, I was like, approximately how many stitches would you pull, right? And I understand that it would take me 10 minutes to make a swatch and to block it, like, not, it's like, it's doable. Like, I understand the process of how it's supposed to be done, but the lazy side of me is trying to pick his brain, right? After doing so many swatches in your life with all those different stitches, the sequence stitches or for marling, do you feel like by now you know it all? Like you can tell just by looking at the yarn how it's going to behave?
Yes and no. So I'm a lot better than I used to be. I can look at a chart, and if a fabric is going to be I'll call it a dud or a loser, I can probably look at the chart and predict it's going to be a dud. But I'll still look at a chart and think something might be amazing. And then when I knit it, it's not as amazing as I thought it was going to be, and it needs some tweaking to get better. So it's definitely a skill to know how to look at a chart and predict how fabric is going to look. But sometimes there's just no substitute for actually making a swatch, especially if it's a more complicated stitch pattern.
Well, talking of complicated stitch patterns, you mentioned that the lady that was your inspiration to start knitting did all these like very difficult Aran sweaters and what have you. Are you tempted to go that way? Because like majority of patterns that you work on, they actually not that difficult, right? Like in the sequence knitting, it's pretty simple. I mean, it's interesting texturally, but it's not very difficult as far as technique. Like, are you ever tempted to go into something like that you haven't done, or something more difficult technically?
So what I'm working, okay, so what I noticed with sequence knitting is there's 4 methods in sequence knitting in the book Sequence Knitting. There's 1 row patterns, there's spiral knitting, which is just sequence knitting in the round. there's the triangles and parallelograms where you have an increase or a decrease at the end of a row. And then there's the serpentine method where the sequence follows the path of the yarn in back and forth knitting. The serpentine method makes very interesting all over textures, but it actually is hard to do. I mean, the concept is really simple, but when you're working on all over texture, it's very easy to make a mistake and you don't see it until you've knit for 10 inches. And then all of a sudden the mistake pops out.
Mm.
So what I've noticed is not very many people do the serpentine method, which is kind of a shame because it results in these very, very beautiful, interesting reversible textures. So what I've been working on for the last many years now, before even making marls, is how can you create a really complicated fabric, a fabric that looks complicated, but can you get the process to be much simpler? And so what I've been doing is I've been taking the one row patterns and interleaving them. And when you interleave the one row patterns, you start to get longer row repeats because one row patterns only have a 2-row repeat. And when you interleave those one row patterns, you can start to build up things that look much, much more interesting. So that's what I'm trying to focus on the simplicity of the process, but I want to get to a complex fabric.
So you do a lot of classes nowadays and you do retreats and teach all different kinds of students. What did you learn from your students? How did you change as an instructor?
So one thing you realize in knitting is most people are really interested in making. They're not really interested in how it works or why it works a certain way. They want to just be a maker. I am much more interested in why it works the way it does. And so what I'm trying to do as a result of my teaching is I'm trying to find a balance where a book or a pattern gives you a how and the why is kind of there for the curious, but not necessary. And I hope I struck that balance in Making Marls where you don't really have to care about the why, but if you want to know about the why, there's enough there that you can dig into.
Right.
It's been a hard lesson for me, by the way, because you think everyone's like you, but everyone's not always like. I mean, of course, we're all different.
I mean, is it difficult for you to teach, or is it something that came very naturally to you?
It is work, which I quite like. So it's hard work, but I don't think it's difficult. I think it requires great empathy to be a good teacher. And I try to listen to my students, and I always try to think about, especially if, let's say, a class has 20 or 30 people in it, I want to make sure that everybody in the class walks out with something good from the experience. And that is not always easy, but I strive for it, and I think I usually achieve it.
Have you ever been asked a question during one of your classes that you didn't have an answer to?
Oh, sure. And I'll just say, I don't know. Yeah. And I think that's really important too. I think humility and curiosity are two of the most important things to have. So it's there's a lot of things that one could know, and I certainly don't have all the answers to them.
Well, do you ever get inspired by the questions during the classes of what other book you need to write, or what other questions you need to answer?
Sometimes, and I feel like one of the things in the knitting world that is a little bit discouraging to me is that our classes tend to be very short. They tend to be 1 hour, half a day, or 1 day. And that's short. And I think sometimes, if we could have a week or two or a month with the same people, it would become a much richer conversation. And I think back to, in America, 50 years ago, we had textile schools, and people actually went to textile school for a year or two or more, and how that would be such a rich experience. But in knitting, you often don't get past the early part of the conversation because the time is way too compressed.
You mentioned the early retirement, but the way I see it, it's not an early retirement, it's a second career that you had to start all over. Is that difficult for you to learn all the new tips and tricks of how to market yourself, how to advertise yourself on social media, how to book classes, how to promote your book? Was that a whole new journey?
it still is. I realize that, really what I like to do is I like to dream up new fabrics. I like to invent new fabric. That's what makes me happy. And I quite love teaching classes and teaching how to do that, or how to make the things I've dreamt up. But marketing is a whole nother level of challenge. And I have Instagram is really the only social media that I use at this point. I've been completely off of Facebook for a couple of years now. I found Facebook overwhelming, and I certainly don't want to go to Twitter. So and Instagram has become harder and harder. I think it's become harder. I think that self-censorship has become bigger. In other words, being much more careful about what you say and how you say it. Because you don't want someone to pounce on you. So you're very careful about how you word things, which is probably good in many ways, but it also is a loss in other ways. It's a loss of an innocence and an exuberance. And I counted yesterday on my feed, every fifth post is an ad. So 20% of what I look at on Instagram is ads. And I haven't posted there in a while because I've kind of lost my mojo on Instagram, and I need to get it back because there's really not a good alternative. So I'm trying. I'm at the point now where I think marketing is my biggest problem, and I'm trying to think about how to get better at that, or how to find someone to help me get better at that.
Right. Well, talking about losing your mojo, like, does that happen with knitting ever?
Well, in my life, yes, but not since 2009. And I'm not saying it couldn't happen. I think it could, but I'm still learning new things. And for me, throughout my life, learning new things has always been, I think, the most joyful experience, for me in life is to discover new things. So knitting is still incredibly full of new learning.
I mean, I feel the same way. Like, I'm relatively new to knitting, and I almost feel like I wasted all my life not knitting, and now to catch up.
Which I'm impressed, because I can see the beautiful shawl behind you and the sweater you're wearing. Those are not simple knitting.
Well, but there is still so much I don't know.
Yes, and there's a lot to know, and there's a lot to be discovered, which is wonderful.
How was the first book writing different from the second one? Was the second one easier because you already knew like everything that needs to be done, how to take good pictures, or like all of that stuff, or was it completely different kind of experience?
So with the second book, I obviously had the experience of the first book, and in the second book, one thing I think about sequence knitting is it has these 4 methods. And in each chapter, there's a stitch dictionary. So if you just open the book, you can find like 20 pages in a row that are photographs of gray swatches to show you a stitch pattern. And I realize sometimes the 20 pages in a row of gray swatches is not exciting enough. People want to flip the page at least every couple pages and see something interesting. So I was really mindful of that in Making Marls, and just thinking about the layout, and thinking about, as someone turns the page, they're on a journey of discovery, and I want them to see something beautiful and interesting, every couple pages. I want them to be excited. That was the biggest difference. I had the mechanical experience, which was really helpful, just in terms of how to get a book to happen, but really thinking about the layout. And also I wanted to explain complicated ideas about marls graphically. And so whenever I had a concept, I wanted to think about, how can I make a graphic that's going to make this clear, as opposed to trying to write it in prose.
Right. Do you think you're going to write another book?
Well, the pizza boxes. Yes, I'm this idea of interleaving the 1-row patterns. That's going to be my next book. And it might be a set of little books, or it might be one more big book. I'm making it like it's going to be a big book, but I may break it up into some small books, because I've gotten a lot of feedback that people want smaller books.
Well, when you think about it, right, there is your artistic vision of something that you're creating versus popular demand.
Yeah.
How much weight do you put onto one versus another? Because like, you might think that the best thing for any person who wants the share of your knowledge is to buy the entire encyclopedia. And they might think that they want a 10-page brochure, right? How do you decide for yourself, like, what's best for you?
I agonize about this constantly. This is really this has been a big question in my mind for the last couple of years. So for the first two books, I did it 100% on my vision of what I wanted, what I thought was best. And I think there are many people who have loved them, and that's been positive. But I also think that there are a lot of people who are they're intimidated by the size, the cost, the weight. A lot of people buy knitting books like in a yarn shop as a discretionary on the fly purchase. But if you're out for the day shopping, you're not going to buy a 5-pound book. You're just not going to carry it, right? It's just, so my overarching goal is to elevate hand knitting. And part of achieving that overarching goal is to reach more people. So I definitely want to make books that more people want.
Well, let me talk to you about that, because I've been thinking, like, a lot of people talk about how they've been knitting all their life, but all they've been knitting are like socks and hats. And again, there's like nothing wrong with knitting whatever brings you joy. However, there is so many techniques to learn, so many different styles of knitting out there. How does one become a better knitter? Like, what would you suggest?
So I think it's very achievable today. It's more achievable today than it ever has been before, because we have two things today that we didn't have 20 years ago. We have Ravelry and we have YouTube. And I think those two technology platforms have been an incredible boon to learning technique and to seeing patterns and to having conversations with other knitters. And so, well, okay, here, I'll tell you my own strategy is to find a repertoire of techniques that you're comfortable with and make them. And then every time you make something, look at it very critically and say, how can I make it better next time? And when you make it better next time, maybe you bring in a new technique, or maybe you change the yarn, but you make very deliberate changes in what you're knitting. So if you're a hat knitter, it's actually perfect, because a hat's a nice small project with lots of learning cycle opportunities, right? You just have to look very critically at your creations and then think about how to improve them.
You know what's interesting? Like, whenever I interview Shetlanders, they always talk about using hat as a swatch, because like before jumping onto a jumper, they do a hat and they see if they like the colors, if the design works, if they like the tension, and that's their swatch, but it's not wasteful in the same time.
I think that's 100% right. So I've been thinking a lot about Fair Isle knitting lately, because marling, with marling, you put colors together and you get optical mixing. And in Fair Isle knitting, depending on the size of the motif, you get sometimes optical mixing and sometimes not, but you get very complicated color interactions, which is why colors are so complicated. And I think about one thing the Shetlanders have going for them is they typically only use one kind of yarn, right? Like, let's say you're a Jamison's person or you're a Jamison and Smith person. You don't have to worry about gauge. You don't have to worry about what color set you're going to work from. You already know your stash is one kind of yarn. And I think in American knitters, one of the reasons why people struggle sometimes is they're constantly changing the yarn. Every single project is a different yarn. I mean,
use the leftovers from whatever other pattern as part of the Fair Isle pattern.
Yeah. Yeah. I think diversity of yarn makes being a good knitter harder.
Well, like when you think about Fair Isle, right? Some of those people, they're like true artists. Like the way they choose the yarn, the colors, it's almost like watercolor. Like they blend them so beautifully that you don't even see where like one color changes into another. It just becomes this like shading effect.
Yes, but think about it another way. If you're a Fair Isle knitter, and let's just say you're working from Jamison's, for example, they have like 180-ish, 200 colors of the jumper weight that you work with Fair Isle. if you're always working with that same material and that same set of colors, and you have colleagues around you who are also working in that same yarn, you're learning so much about how those colors mix and how to use them. It's back to Kay Fawcett. Part of why Kay Fawcett is such a great colorist is because he practices, right? He spent his whole life constantly doing color work. And I think if you're working always in different yarns, and if you do like big projects like a yoked sweater, it may take you 6 or 12 months to make one project done. So in the Fair Isle world, if you do hats, you learn. It's all about learning cycles and learning rate.
Well, do you know, like in Fair Isle, like there is certain colors that like traditional colors that they would use, right? So let's say you take a hat and they have like 6 colors that already have been tested, knitted for hundreds of years. They know it's going to work. This marling, do you get the sense that there are some colors that marl better than others?
I think there are no rules. But if you have colors that have high contrast, the marl is going to be very gritty. And if you have colors that are close, the marl is going to basically make a new solid. So I think there's a lot you can play with contrast. But I don't think, the thing about color that's very interesting is whenever you think there's a combination that's ugly, someone then takes it and makes something beautiful from it. So you really have to be careful with color using any kind of pejorative, because our taste keeps moving.
Well, I asked Stephen West if there was like any color that he feels uncomfortable with. And he was like, well, I love all colors, but I have been avoiding brown, but now I'm using brown as an accent color because it gives such a punch. Like, are there any colors you don't like?
No, there are no colors I don't like. Now, I think when people hear that question, they most often, I know that when I've taught my classes, we actually have this exact conversation. And what women immediately visualize is they try and imagine themselves in a dress that goes from their chin to their heels in that color. There are lots of colors I would not wear in a dress all over on me. But those colors as part of another motif can be fabulous. So I think it's all about the context. There's no bad color. There's no color I would want taken away from me in the palette, but I don't necessarily want to have a giant, like, for example, if I find that a color that's the color of my skin, like peach or pale pink, if I wear a great expanse of it, I just look like a big blob of, flesh. So there's certainly colors that I wouldn't want to wear a whole dress in, but those peachy pinks are incredibly good blending colors and incredibly nice when used in combination with other colors.
When you were in the corporate world, did people know that you were knitting? Like, was that ever part of the conversation?
So in the company that I spent most of my career at, people kind of knew I was working on a book, but I would never knit at work. So it was very low key, very much a hobby. And it was a corporate culture where I don't think it was very knitting friendly. So I never really felt comfortable, certainly ever knitting at work or really talking about it a lot. When I left that company and went to the next one, I had just been launching Sequence Knitting. And so even my job interview was all about, hey, I've just launched this knitting book. I'm going to have some teaching engagements. And they were really, really nice about it and really interested in it. I think it was, I went into that environment where being a knitter was part of my identity, as opposed to going into the other one where it wasn't, and then it developed.
Right. Were your friends and like your coworkers surprised that you decided to go full-time into knitting?
I think a little bit. And it was interesting because I agonized for about a year before I finally made the plunge, and I gave my company 6 weeks notice when I decided I was going to basically quit the job and go do the knitting full-time. And I had a lot of side conversations. I worked in high tech, so most of my colleagues were men. I talked to so many men who were between the ages of, say, 50 and 65. And so many of them wanted to retire, but there were two problems. Some of them had both problems. Some of them only had one. A lot of them couldn't afford to retire. because they didn't have enough saved away. And a lot of them didn't know what they would do with themselves if they did. So I felt very lucky that I kind of had, I had been working toward a financial plan. I also felt lucky that I had something I was thrilled to go pursue. And I think that's not as common as it should be.
I mean, do you feel like you're living your dream?
To some extent, yeah, I am. I'm living life on my terms. And sometimes I miss the high tech. Sometimes I miss the technical problems, which were so interesting, to have to work through, and with brilliant, lovely people who were also trying to solve these hard problems. But when you work in a corporate environment, you have a boss, you have to be pleasing, you have annual job reviews, you have hiring and firing and layoffs. And I'm quite happy to be self-employed and be, not having to worry about most of that.
Well, do you feel like you're working harder than before?
I worked pretty hard. I was a workaholic, I would say, by almost any standard. So I worked quite hard. So I don't know if I'm working harder, but I don't know that I'm working any less either. And when you're self-employed, you don't have boundaries, and so the week, Saturday is the same as Friday. You kind of work in all the cracks, and when are you working and when does it not work? But I will also say, and this was even true when I was working for a company, when you want to spend your spare time working, you're actually quite lucky, because to be interested in your work is a gift.
Well, when you go to classes, when you teach classes, or you go to festivals, or you go to retreats, how did your life change, like meeting all those knitters, becoming friends with other instructors, becoming friends with other designers?
In some ways it was the same, because I always had some mentors in high tech who were lovely people who you could get mentorship from, and coaching and learning from. And I have a few people like that in the knitting world who have been very generous of their wisdom and their time with me. One thing, and my life was very global too. In my high tech life, it was very much spread across the whole world, and my knitting friends are spread across a pretty big geography as well. But it was different going from a kind of all men to almost all women. That was very different. And I also think that the economics are very different. So when you go to a knitting event, it's just a completely different economic expectation of how everything is going to be compared to a corporate life.
Right.
And sometimes I think that's too bad, that knitting is so underpaid compared to high tech.
Well, do you think it's like, how did we get to this point? Because like I talk a lot about it with all the people that I interview, that we're very comfortable charging our rate in our corporate jobs. And yet when it comes to our pay, being paid as an artist, as a fiber artist, for your designs, for your finished objects, or for whatever, we suddenly feel ashamed to ask minimal wage. Like, how do you think we can change that?
I don't have an answer for that. I think it's a great question. The problem is that the actual amount of capital or money in the knitting market, if you did like a market analysis of all the money there in knitting, it's just much, much less than in semiconductors. I mean, it's by an order of magnitude or two or three. There might be let's say $2 trillion or $10 trillion. I don't know how much in semiconductors. It's probably, is there a billion in knitting? I don't know, but it's a lot less. And a lot of knitting businesses are kind of just, run at low margin and are hobby businesses. I mean, a lot of people in knitting don't pay the rent with their knitting.
Right. Well, when you told me that you spent some part of the day just thinking, are we talking about like planning the future, thinking about like what else you can, what other sequences you can find? Like, what are you thinking about?
So what for the last, so since Making Marls came out, and now I've been thinking about kind of two things I think about. One is individual patterns to develop, because each pattern is its own puzzle to make. So one pattern, back to minimum wage, patterns, you put a lot of time into a pattern that doesn't exactly get paid for in terms of all your thought time. And then the other thing I've been thinking about is this idea of creating interleaved one row patterns to create new stitch patterns that didn't exist before. And so those two things are what I probably put most of my thought time into. And now just in the last couple of weeks, I've really started working on this next book. And so now I'm actually, in the computer, making charts, writing tables and text, and starting to frame out an actual book. And so that's not exactly thinking time, but you do think a lot while you're doing that kind of work. And so that's just in the last couple of weeks, how I'm spending my time is changing quite a bit, because I'm starting to really plunge in, and that feels great. I'm really happy about that.
When you look back at like everything you've done so far, what do you feel like has been your biggest achievement today?
That's a good question. I think getting the idea of sequence knitting out in the world is maybe the biggest, because it was an idea that was always sitting there. And in many ways, all knitting is sequence knitting. But I think to articulate how to create knit fabric in a different way in such an old craft, I think was quite cool and interesting. And I hope that all knitters will know the phrase sequence knitting and think about it as they knit.
Well, when you wrote the sequence knitting, what was your biggest goal for it? Like, did you think that people gonna buy the book, they can create some patterns for themselves by using multiple sequences, combining them together? Like, what was your goal for it?
My goal was to inspire creativity. And I hadn't quite complete. There is this thing in knitting where people don't want to steal somebody else's idea. So people tend to self-censor themselves in the knitting world and not want to like copy somebody else overtly. But a stitch dictionary for me is a creative tool. And so I would like to see more designers take sequence knitting ideas and use them. And this next book or set of books, I'm going to be much more explicit about take these ideas and use them. Don't worry about where they came from. Just go use them, because I think that some of the most meaningful books ever done in the history of knitting are Barbara Walker's Four Treasuries. And people have no reluctance to take stitch patterns from those books and go run with them. And I love that. And so I really want more of that. I want more people to play with marls. I want more people to use the ideas of sequence knitting in their designs. And I want to create something that 50 years from now, people are going to go, well, those books really help me do what I want to do. That's
well, like this is like something I've talked to a lot of guests of my channel. What do you consider an original design, right? Because there are plenty of designers out there who would go to Stitch Dictionary, pick one stitch pattern from here and one pattern from here, combine it into one scarf and call it a new pattern. Or take one stitch pattern, put it in a cowl and call it a new pattern, right? What's your feeling about it? What makes an original design?
Well, I think that the legal definition is probably the right one. The legal definition basically says that, you wrote your own copy, you took your own pictures, and the concept is not protected. So in knitting, take a stockinette raglan sweater. How many stockinette raglan sweater patterns are there on Ravelry? The first stockinette raglan sweater, I think Marjorie Tillotson probably talked about it in the early 20th century, and they probably were knit even a little bit before her. So originality of design is not a criteria for what makes a pattern or a design. Now, originality of design is important to me personally. I don't, there's no, the overhead and cost of writing a pattern for what you make back from it is, for me, poor enough that that's not why I would write a pattern. I write a pattern because it's some idea that I think is interesting, or I've planned to do an event with a yarn company and I want to support that yarn company by coming out with a pattern that's going to help them. The ideas are more important than the pattern itself. But I'm amazed at how many patterns get published on Ravelry and how many people pay for patterns that are a rework of things that have been done again and again and again.
Well, in your case, like what comes first? Is it like the chicken or the egg? Like, do you first have the idea for a pattern and then you choose the stitch pattern for it, like design this the stitch pattern, or do you have some sequence pattern that you want to try and then you think, what can I make out of it?
So I have a digital file of ideas. I call it my idea file, and it's like 50 pages long. And so, and like each page is an idea. And then if someone comes to me and says, hey, please do a pattern for this event, or if usually for me to do an individual pattern, there's usually some motivator like an event or a yarn company. So they say, please do it, and so I go look at what yarns they have, what gauges they're at. Is it something that could be done with marls, or are the yarns too thick to be marled? If they're too thick to be marled, it's going to be a sequence knitting pattern. And then I often will ask for a selection of yarns so that I can feel them and swatch them. And then I'll go to my idea file and I'll just flip through the pages and I'll see if there's something that I see in my idea file that inspires me. And often there'll be some little nugget, and then I'll just run after that and it'll end up somewhere good. It's a flowing organic kind of process.
I saw you showing like some of the examples of your knitting, and there would be like one stitch difference between like 4 different things, and all the difference between them would be like +1.
Yeah.
Is it difficult for you to choose which one you want to go with, like for your designs?
Because and I think sometimes the patterns that I find the most interesting are the ones that actually have a sequence knitting concept in them. So I just recently reissued the Revolution watch cap pattern. This was a pattern that I did for Rib magazine, which was a magazine that was a Canadian magazine. It only existed for 3 issues and it was focused on men who knit. And I did a hat pattern where the hat is basically all of the fabrics you can make from knit 3, purl 3 in a panel. And I love it because I love the fact that you kind of learn how sequence knitting works when you make it. And it makes this beautiful, interesting textural movement as well. So that for me was really great. And I was glad to get to reissue it because that magazine sadly is gone and that pattern kind of got lost. But it didn't force me to have to choose one pattern because I could put them all in the pattern.
Right. Do you dream of knitting? Like when you
absolutely. When you're really working on a good pattern, because night after night, it's like in your dreams. And, that's when I think you really figure stuff out.
I mean, now that you like so into knitting, do you find it difficult to talk to your like former colleagues and stuff? Like, do you find it difficult to communicate with regular people that don't belong to the knitting world?
I think that when you're with people, you always have something to learn from other people. And I think also in knitting, if you think about technology or the arts, there's inspiration in every direction. So it's okay. It's okay. And I think it's hard sometimes, even people who are into knitting, they maybe aren't into it the way I am. There are not very many people who like to develop stitch patterns. That's a pretty small community in the world.
Do you have like a favorite project that you ever created that you would want people to talk about like 50 years from now?
I don't know that I have one particular pattern. This little vest that I'm wearing, I'm really happy with, but I don't know if the 50-year test is a pretty big test. But I have some design details that I really like. If you think about it, I think it's like my own design language. And this was, I think, the first piece where I put that all together into a bigger project, like a bigger project than a hat. So the idea of how do you use reversible fabrics in garments? How do you get the fabric to come all the way to the edge so you don't need to have like a big selvage on the fabric? How do you balance the need for drape and fit with the ease of knitting? So I think this piece, it's called the IB vest. I think it's the first time I put all that together in a really good way. But I'm hoping there'll be patterns to come that will be even better. So that's why I say I think that to date it's all this journey, and sometimes you don't know what the real winners are till you have historical context to look back.
Well, when you're talking about it, right, like historically speaking, if we met in 2010, we wouldn't be talking about like all the books you wrote and all the patterns you wrote. It was all ahead of you. What do you think is ahead of you now?
So of course I'm more than 10 years older now too. So I think I have this concept in my mind of this next book or books, which is going to be, I think, quite a body of work. And I really want to get that done. And I don't know if it's going to take me 1 year or 3 years, but it's going to be a big job to do it. And after that, I think I might just be done with books, and I might just try and move back toward being a individual who, does my own puzzles. I can't see past that one right now. And I think I also might want, the freedom. When you're thinking like a knitting designer, it colors every choice you make in knitting, the yarns you choose, the patterns you choose to make, how you spend your time. And I think after I get this done, I might want the freedom to just be selfish more.
Well, when was last time you knitted somebody else's pattern?
Before 2009.
Okay, so like if you were to pick one pattern that you would want to knit now, after these 3 books or 4 books or whatever series of books you're planning to publish, do you have an idea in mind of what kind of pattern would it be?
No, nothing today. There's a lot of things that I think are really, really beautiful. There's a lot of sweater patterns that have been done in the last decade that I think are beautiful. There are not a lot that would fit me very well. As someone who's always been overweight with kind of a weird size, and that's a whole nother conversation on size inclusivity and how you customize designs. So there's no pattern that I would love to play with. I do kind of miss cables. I used to like to knit cables, and cables are a whole different way of thinking than I have been thinking about. And I haven't yet done any swatching, but how cables interact with sequence knitting, I think, is an opportunity to play with. But there's a lot of cabled sweaters out there that are really beautiful, and traveling twisted stitch patterns that are really beautiful. But that's just too much for my brain to get to right now.
I can't wait to see what else you're gonna create, because to me this is fascinating to see you like constantly thinking about all the possibilities out there. It's really inspiring.
Oh, well, thank you. It's so wonderful to have things that you haven't thought of yet, but you can have a confidence that you'll think of something. That's as long as I have that feeling, I will keep going. And I think when that feeling goes away, then I'll know I'm done.
Well, I hope it never does.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecelia, for being my guest. Thank you for telling me all your plans and sharing your thought process. I really loved getting to know you, and it's been a privilege to get to know you.
Thank you. It's been a joy to talk with you too. I really appreciate you inviting me.
Thank you.